September 19th, 1944. A German Panther tank commander peers through fog so thick he can barely see 50 meters ahead. His vehicle is a masterpiece of engineering. The long 75mm gun can destroy any American tank at 2,000 meters, double the effective range of anything the Americans can shoot back with. His frontal armor is over 3 inches of hardened steel, sloped at a 60-degree angle that effectively doubles its resistance to incoming rounds. The men who built this tank designed it specifically to dominate anything the Western Allies could field against it, and it should have worked. On paper, this engagement was not a battle. It was a harvest. By sundown, his entire brigade will be gone. Not beaten back, gone. Of the Panthers that rolled into the fog that morning near the small French town of Ericourt, fewer than a third will return operational. They will be destroyed not by a better tank, not by a miracle weapon. They will be destroyed by something that terrifies military professionals, far more than superior hardware. They will be destroyed by a system, a machine built from the wreckage of one of the most catastrophic American military failures of the 20th century. This is not a story about the Sherman tank. The Sherman was, if we're being honest with the engineering data, an inferior vehicle. German commanders were correct to hold it in contempt. This is the forensic breakdown of how the United States Army transformed from the most embarrassingly defeated armored force on the Western Front to the most tactically effective one in 18 months, and why that transformation terrified Germany's elite Panzer divisions, not because of what the Americans built, but because of what they became. To understand what killed those Panthers in September 1944, we need to go back to where this story actually begins. February 1943, a mountain pass in Tunisia called Kasserine, and a defeat so complete, so humiliating, that it reshaped the entire American military philosophy for the rest of the war, because the Germans had every reason to believe the Americans were amateurs. And for exactly 6 weeks, they were right. Part 1. The humiliation and the lesson inside it. Think about what the Wehrmacht had actually seen by February 1943. They had conquered Poland in 4 weeks. They had destroyed France in 6. France, which had spent 20 years building the Maginot Line and calling it the finest defensive system on earth. They had driven the British Expeditionary Force into the English Channel at Dunkirk. They had pushed to the gates of Moscow and the sands of Egypt. Against every opponent they had faced, the Wehrmacht had prevailed. And they had prevailed using a philosophy of war that was, by 1943, the most sophisticated military system on earth. Blitzkrieg was not a tactic. It was a doctrine built around speed, initiative, combined arms integration, and the deliberate targeting of an enemy's command structure rather than his frontline troops. Paralyzed the brain, and the body collapses on its own. It had worked in Poland. It had worked in France. It had worked in the Balkans and across 2,000 miles of the Eastern Front. The Germans had not lost a major campaign in 4 years of total war. German intelligence had already labeled the American military as Britain's Italians, a phrase suggesting America would provide the same quantity of enthusiastic incompetence that Italy had provided to the Axis cause. They had numbers. They had factories. What they lacked, the Wehrmacht's analysts believed, was the warrior spirit to use either effectively. On February 19, 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel launched his Africa Corps against American positions at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. What followed was not a battle. It was confirmation. The U.S. Second Corps attacked in parade ground formations, tanks advancing in neat V-shapes like cavalry from a previous century. No infantry coordination, no artillery integration, no reconnaissance. The Corps commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, had built his headquarters in a ravine 70 miles behind the front lines and communicated with his officers in a bizarre personal code his own staff struggled to decipher. He had never visited the front. He had no accurate picture of what was happening to his men. Rommel's panzers scattered the 1st Armored Division across 30 miles of desert in hours. In 5 days, 2nd Corps was driven back more than 50 miles. American losses exceeded 6,500 men, 183 tanks destroyed, over 100 half-tracks lost, more than 200 artillery pieces abandoned, 500 trucks scattered across the desert. Roughly 20% of the engaged force simply ceased to exist as a fighting unit. American equipment littered the Tunisian desert for miles. German commanders drew what seemed like the obvious conclusion. America had wealth, it did not have soldiers. Here's the fact that no German intelligence officer wrote in his report. The fact that explains everything that follows. The American army did not see Kasserine as a defeat to be rationalized. It treated Kasserine as a data set. Within days of the collapse, officers were filing after-action reports with a level of institutional honesty that was, by the standards of any army in that war, extraordinary. What went wrong? Specifically. Not philosophically. Specifically. Fredendall's communications failures were documented, engagement by engagement. The absence of combined arms coordination was mapped through every critical decision point. The failure to use reconnaissance assets was traced through the chain of command. And when the analysis was complete, the Army did something that sounds simple, but is actually one of the most difficult things any institution can do. It fired the people who failed and replaced them with people who understood the analysis. Fredendall was removed from command on March 6, 1943. His replacement was George S. Patton. Patton had exactly 17 days to transform a shattered corps before the Germans attacked again. Think about that. 17 days, the same men, the same equipment, the same German enemy. March 23, 1943, El Ghoutar, Tunisia. The 10th Panzer Division, the same formation that had helped shatter American forces 6 weeks earlier, commits 50 of its 57 available tanks in a dawn attack down the El Ghoutar Valley. German commanders expected the same result they had seen at Kasserine. They had no reason to expect anything different. What they found instead was a kill zone. Patton had placed the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, M3 gun motor carriages, half-tracks with 75mm guns, in concealed positions along the valley walls. Artillery observers had pre-registered fire on every German approach route. A minefield at the valley entrance stalled 8 German tanks in the opening minutes, bunching the following vehicles into a compressed formation with no room to maneuver. When the American guns opened fire from 3 directions simultaneously, the Germans could not identify a single firing position. They could not advance through the minefield. They could not retreat without exposing their thinner rear armor. When the engagement ended, the 10th Panzer Division had lost more than 30 tanks. The 601st claimed 37 kills among 52 armored vehicles destroyed. It was the first time American forces had defeated an experienced German armored formation in open battle. Rommel himself noted in private papers, recovered after the war, that American commanders had absorbed the lessons of mobile warfare with remarkable speed. The man who had scattered this same army 6 weeks earlier was watching it fight back with systematic precision. But El Ghoutar was a preview, not the performance itself. Because what the Germans had not yet seen, what was being built behind the tactical improvements, underneath the better leadership, inside the institutional machinery that Kasserine had exposed as broken, and that the Americans were now repairing with cold scientific precision. That was the thing that would eventually do something no German armor had experienced. It would make experienced panzer crews afraid. The first German officer to encounter this system at full power would not survive the experience with his division intact. His name was Fritz Bayerlin, and what happened to him on the morning of July 25, 1944, is one of the most harrowing accounts of what industrial-scale American firepower actually felt like from inside the target zone. But to understand what Bayerlin walked into, you first need to understand the 4 pillars America spent 18 months constructing after Kasserine, because each one was designed to neutralize a specific German advantage. And when all 4 operated simultaneously, that was when the terror began. Part 2. The 4 pillars. Building the machine. Start with artillery. Not because it was the most spectacular element of the American system, it wasn't, but because it was the foundation everything else was built on. And the numbers behind it are the kind that German veterans, decades later, still described with something close to awe. The American Army perfected a technique called time-on-target fire, a concept the British had pioneered in North Africa using BBC radio time signals to synchronize guns. Americans industrialized it, and scaled it beyond anything the British or anyone else had matched. Multiple artillery batteries, positioned miles apart, firing at different trajectories and different angles, coordinated so that every shell from every gun arrived at the target simultaneously. Not sequentially, simultaneously. The first round and the 20th round impacted within seconds of each other. There was no warning interval, no progressive buildup of sound that allowed soldiers to take cover between the first shell and the barrage. For a German infantryman caught in the open, the transition from silence to destruction had no middle stage. You were standing, then you were not. The response times were what broke German operational planning. A forward observer embedded with frontline units, riding inside the lead tank of an armored column, crouched in a ditch beside the infantry, could call for battalion fire support and receive it within 3 minutes. Divisional artillery arrived within 6 minutes. Corps-level mass fires in 9. German artillery typically required 30 minutes or more to respond to the same fire request. The Americans were 4 to 10 times faster at every level of command. For German forces, whose entire operational doctrine depended on rapid concentration, rapid movement, and rapid response. This was not an inconvenience. It was a fundamental threat to the philosophical foundation of how they fought. Every German plan that required pausing, regrouping, or consolidating became a fire mission the moment it was executed. But artillery alone was just artillery. The second pillar is what made the American system something German commanders had no doctrinal counter to: air-ground integration. By the summer of 1944, the partnership between Patton's Third Army and Brigadier General Otto Wayland's 19th Tactical Air Command had evolved into something no pre-war military theory had anticipated. Air liaison officers rode inside the lead tanks of armored columns, carrying VHF radios. When the column encountered resistance, the liaison officer could direct P-47 Thunderbolts onto the target within minutes. Pilots and tankers trained together. They learned each other's capabilities and limitations. They create improvised tactics in real time that no manual had codified because the manuals couldn't keep up. German soldiers gave the P-47 a name, Jabo, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber. They called the Normandy front the Jabostrecke, the fighter-bomber racetrack. Any vehicle that moved in daylight attracted attack within minutes. German columns could not resupply. Reinforcements could not reach the front. Reserves could not concentrate. The Wehrmacht's entire operational system, built around rapid concentration of force at decisive points, was being systematically strangled from the air. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding German forces in the West, wrote directly to Hitler that, in the face of total enemy air superiority, there were no available tactics to compensate for the annihilating effect of air power except to retreat from the battlefield entirely. General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's chief of fighters, was blunter. From the first moment of the Allied invasion, the Luftwaffe was absent from the skies over France. The answer was that 2 years of strategic bombing and attritional air combat had left virtually nothing for the Western Front. The skies belonged to the Allies. The ground was the only place Germany still had options, and those options were shrinking by the week. 2 pillars: artillery you couldn't outrun, air power you couldn't hide from. The third pillar is the one German commanders found most difficult to explain after the war, because it required them to acknowledge something they had dismissed from the beginning about their enemy. The Americans were institutional learners. Systematic, relentless, institutional learners at a speed and scale the Wehrmacht had no mechanism to match. After-action reviews, lessons learned documents distributed across the command, officer replacement based on demonstrated performance, not seniority or political connection, a genuine willingness to discard doctrine that wasn't working and replace it with doctrine derived from what actually happened in combat, sometimes within days of an engagement. The institutional machinery that had treated Kasserine as a dataset rather than a defeat was now running continuously, ingesting every battle and producing updated doctrine faster than the Germans could observe and respond. And no moment demonstrated this third pillar more vividly than what happened in the hedgerow country of Normandy in June and July 1944. Because the American army ran into a problem that its tactics, its air power, and its artillery could not solve, And the solution came not from a general or an engineer. It came from a sergeant who had sold whiskey before the war. Curtis Grubb Cullen, Jr., 30 years old, a National Guardsman from Cranford, New Jersey. Before the war, he had worked as a sales promotion assistant for Shenley Industries, a liquor distributor. No engineering training, no technical background, simply a man who paid close attention to problems and refused to accept that they were permanent. The problem he was looking at was the bocage, the ancient earthen hedgerows of Normandy, 4 feet of compacted earth topped with tangled vegetation 15 feet high, root systems 3 to 12 feet deep, surrounding fields no wider than 300 feet. When Sherman tanks tried to climb over a hedgerow, they exposed their belly armor, the thinnest on the vehicle, to German anti-tank teams positioned on the other side. The existing gaps through the hedges were pre-registered by Panzer teams in ambush. Every obvious approach was a death trap. The Allied advance had slowed to roughly 1 mile per day at catastrophic cost. During a brainstorming session about the hedgerow problem, a Tennessee soldier named Roberts made an offhand suggestion. What if you put saw teeth at the front of the tank and cut through the hedge instead of climbing over it? Most of the men in the room laughed. Cullen did not. He fashioned a 4-pronged steel plow from captured German beach obstacles, the Czech hedgehog anti-invasion barriers that had littered the Normandy beaches on D-Day, X-shaped steel structures designed to rip the bottoms out of Allied landing craft. He welded this device onto the bow of a Sherman tank. On July 14th, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley watched the demonstration. The tank accelerated to 10 miles per hour, hit the hedgerow, and drove through it. Not over it, through it, cutting under the root system, keeping the nose down, emerging on the other side with its belly armor never exposed. Bradley immediately grasped the implications. He ordered mass production. Ordnance units worked around the clock under camouflage netting, cutting German beach obstacles into teeth and welding them onto tank hulls. In 11 days, approximately 500 Rhino devices were manufactured and installed. 3 out of every 5 tanks in First Army carried the modification by the launch of Operation Cobra on July 25th. A liquor salesman with a welding torch had solved a problem that was paralyzing an entire Army group, using steel the enemy had placed there to stop the invasion. Cullen received the Legion of Merit. 4 months later, he lost a leg to a landmine in the Hurtgen Forest. He went home, returned to selling whiskey, and died in 1963 at 48 years old. His name appears in almost no popular histories of the war, but his Rhino device enabled Operation Cobra. And what Cobra did to the German army in Normandy connects directly to what happened at Aricourt, and to why those Panther commanders in September 1944 had no answer for what was killing them. Remember that detail. We'll need it. Men like Curtis Cullen didn't fight for glory. They fought because a problem needed solving and someone had to solve it. A sergeant with a welding torch changed the course of a campaign. Every like on this video is a small act of keeping that kind of story visible. Not the generals on the monuments, but the sergeant no one made a monument to. Part 3. The Machine at Full Power. Cobra and the Road to Aricourt. July 25th, 1944. 9:38 in the morning. Normandy. Fritz Bayerlein commands Panzer Lehr, one of the most elite formations in the German army. Not a reserve division, not a hastily assembled brigade. Panzer Lehr had been built specifically from instructors, men chosen because they were the finest tank crews in Germany, pulled from the training schools to demonstrate to the rest of the Wehrmacht how armored warfare was supposed to look. His men had fought in North Africa, in Sicily, in the brutal hedgerow fighting of early Normandy. They were, by every conventional military measure, the finest armored division available to defend Western France. On the morning of July the 25th, Panzer Lehr sat directly in the impact zone of Operation Cobra. Bradley's plan was brutal in its simplicity. Concentrate overwhelming force on a single corridor, 7,000 yards wide just west of St. Lo, and smash through it with everything he had. The bombardment that preceded the ground assault was unlike anything the Western Front had witnessed. 1,500 heavy bombers, 60 groups of medium bombers in support, fighter bombers dropping 60,000 incendiary cluster munitions across 12 square kilometers, 3,300 tons of high explosives delivered in 90 minutes into a space smaller than a mid-sized American city. Bayerlein was inside the box. His account of what followed remains one of the most harrowing primary sources from the entire European campaign. "The bombers came as if on a conveyor belt," he wrote afterward. "Back and forth the carpets were laid. Artillery positions were obliterated. Tanks were overturned and buried. Infantry positions were flattened. Several of his men went clinically mad and ran into the open until shell fragments cut them down." When Field Marshal von Kluge demanded that Bayerlein hold the line, the Panzer Lehr commander sent back a reply that military historians still quote, "Out in front, everyone is holding out. Everyone. My grenadiers, my engineers, my tank crews. They are all holding their ground. Not a single man is leaving his post. They are lying silent in their foxholes because they are dead." Over 70% of Panzer Lehr's effective strength was destroyed before a single American infantryman crossed the start line. One of the most elite divisions in the German army had been annihilated not by superior tanks, not by a special weapon, but by all four pillars operating simultaneously at full intensity: fast artillery, coordinated air power, the Rhino-equipped Shermans tearing through hedgerows that had held the advance for 7 weeks, and the supply network that could sustain this scale of operation indefinitely. The breakthrough that followed was stunning even to the Americans executing it. By July 28th, the 4th Armored Division had seized Coutances. By July 31st, 6 days after Cobra began, it had captured Avranches and taken 20,000 prisoners. Patton took command of 3rd Army on August 1st and turned the breach into a torrent. Germany committed approximately 2,300 tanks and assault guns to the Normandy campaign total. Only 100 to 120 escaped across the Seine River. The rest were destroyed, abandoned, or captured. The German army in the West had been shattered. It would never fully recover. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn, because Cobra was overwhelming force, a sledgehammer. What came next was the scalpel, and the scalpel was more instructive because at Ericourt in September 1944, the Americans didn't have the sledgehammer. The fog over the battlefield neutralized their air power. They were outnumbered in tanks. They were facing brand new Panthers crewed by German soldiers who had trained on them. By conventional military logic, the Germans should have won. They didn't. And the margin by which they didn't, nearly 3-1 in American favor, is the clearest possible proof that the American system worked not because of overwhelming resources, but because of something more durable. But before we get to Ericourt, we need to understand one more character. A vehicle that the conventional military wisdom of 1944 said shouldn't have been able to kill a Panther at all. By early September 1944, Patton's 3rd Army had covered 300 miles across France in 3 weeks. Then the fuel ran out, not because of a German action, but because the advance had outrun even the Red Ball Express, the truck convoy route running 24-hour shifts, moving over 12,500 tons of supplies per day at its peak, 6,000 trucks continuously in motion. Even that system couldn't maintain pace with a breakout that fast. Tanks sat idle waiting for gasoline. The pause gave Germany a window. General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army assembled 262 tanks and assault guns for a counter-offensive in Lorraine, 182 tanks and 80 assault guns. 2 brand new Panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th, equipped with Panthers fresh from the factory. The crews were new. The brigades had not worked together as units. Many personnel could not read military maps accurately. They had conducted no reconnaissance of the terrain they were about to fight in. They had no organic artillery support. But they had Panthers. And Panthers, they believed, were the answer to anything a Sherman could do. Opposing them was Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division under Colonel Bruce Clark. Clark had fewer than 100 tanks available, vastly outnumbered. His tankers had spent weeks in static defense around Ericourt. They knew every ridgeline, every woodline, every approach route, scouted, mapped, artillery pre-registered. And Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion at the center of the American defense in his 4th, Sherman named Thunderbolt. The previous 3 has been knocked out underneath him, had positioned his vehicles in hull-down positions on terrain he had personally selected. When German tanks appeared out of the fog on September 19th, American guns were already trained on the approach routes. The Germans had to search for targets while driving forward blind. The Americans merely had to wait. In armored warfare, the side that fires first wins the overwhelming majority of engagements. The Americans fired first, systematically, from positions the German crews never located. But the engagement that most precisely captures what the American system had become, the engagement that reveals the scalpel underneath the sledgehammer, did not involve a Sherman tank at all. Part 4. The Kill Zone. What really terrified Germany's Panzer divisions? Lieutenant Edwin Leiper, 26 years old, commander of the 1st Platoon, Charlie Company, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, 4 vehicles under his command, M18 Hellcats. The M18 Hellcat was, by conventional military logic, an absurd design. While Germany had spent the latter years of the war building heavier, more heavily armored tanks, the Panther at 45 tons, the Tiger at 57, the Americans had built the opposite. The M18 weighed approximately 20 tons. Its frontal armor was 13 millimeters thick, less protection than an armored car. A heavy machine gun at close range could penetrate it. By every traditional metric of what a tank was supposed to be, the Hellcat was not in that category. What it was, instead, was a weapon built around a different philosophy entirely. The fastest tracked vehicle of the war, 55 miles per hour on roads. It mounted a high-velocity 76mm gun capable of killing any German tank from the flank or rear, and it was crewed by men who had trained specifically not to fight fair. The M18's entire tactical doctrine was built around 3 actions: ambush, kill, relocate. Do not trade blows with Panthers. Their frontal armor makes that a losing proposition regardless of what gun you carry. Get the first shot from a position the enemy cannot identify. Kill. Move before they can return fire. Kill again from a new position. Repeat until the enemy formation is destroyed. The Hellcat was not designed to survive being hit. It was designed to avoid being hit while killing the enemy. That philosophical inversion, speed and doctrine over armor, was itself a product of institutional learning. The Americans had studied the North Africa data, identified what actually killed German armor in practice, and concluded that the answer was not heavier American vehicles. It was smarter employment. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had been the first unit in the Army to receive M18 Hellcats, taking delivery in the spring of 1944. By Ericourt, they had refined their ambush tactics through months of combat experience. Leiper positioned his 4 Hellcats behind a low ridge overlooking the German approach route on the morning of September 19th. The fog was dense enough to conceal his vehicles from the valley floor, thin enough to see the outline of a Panther at a few hundred meters. When the tanks of the 113th Panzer Brigade rolled into the valley, his vehicles fired from concealment. The Panther crews had no idea where the shots were coming from. Put yourself inside one of those Panther turrets for a moment. You have the most feared medium tank on the Western Front. Your frontal armor has never been penetrated in a direct engagement at battle ranges. Your gun has a range advantage that makes Sherman tanks vulnerable at distances where they can barely see you, and something is killing you from a direction you cannot identify, at a range where your armor is irrelevant because the shots are striking from the flank. The tank to your left stops moving. The tank to your right is on fire. You have 6 weeks of training. You were told the Panthers would be decisive. You have no procedure for this scenario. Leiper's 4 vehicles destroyed at least 14 German tanks before the survivors could organize any response. The surviving Hellcat withdrew before German forces could locate and engage it. 4 M18s, 14 Panthers. The mathematics of a doctrine working exactly as designed. Across the entire war, the M18 Hellcat claimed 526 confirmed enemy tank kills at an overall kill-to-loss ratio of 2.4 to 1. In the European theater specifically, 2.3 to 1. These victories were not achieved by superior armor or superior firepower. They were achieved by superior doctrine, applied by trained crews who had internalized the philosophy of their weapon and the philosophy behind it, which was, at its core, know what you are, fight on your terms, and never let the enemy dictate the engagement. But Aricourt, on September 20th, acquired a dimension that no German operational planner could have anticipated. Something was attacking German tanks from the air, not thunderbolts. The fog had grounded the P-47s for most of the battle. Something smaller, something slower, something that, by every rational assessment, could not kill a Panther. Major Charles Carpenter was an artillery observation pilot. His aircraft was a Piper L-4 Grasshopper, a fabric-covered, unarmored, two-seat observation plane with a top speed of roughly 85 miles per hour, weighing under 1,000 pounds. The Luftwaffe did not bother shooting at them as a matter of policy because there was no tactical reason to expend ammunition on a vehicle that posed no threat. Carpenter had modified his. He attached 6 M1 bazooka launchers to the wing struts, 3 per side, wired into the cockpit for electrical firing. He named the aircraft Rosie the Rocketer. Before the war, he'd been a high school history teacher. On September 20th, when morning fog lifted around noon, and Carpenter spotted a company of German Panther tanks advancing toward Aricourt, he dove at them through intense ground fire. German infantry had very quickly revised their policy on observation planes, firing his bazookas in repeated passes. He returned to base twice to reload, flew 3 sorties total that afternoon, and fired 16 bazooka rockets. He was credited with destroying 4 German tanks and an armored car, confirmed by multiple ground witnesses. Over his career at Aricourt and afterward, Carpenter was credited with 6 tank kills total. He may be the only pilot in aviation history to become an armored vehicle ace in a fabric-covered observation plane. He was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma shortly after the battle and told he had approximately 2 years to live. He lived for 22 more. He died in 1966. Almost nobody has heard of him. By the end of September 1944, Monteufel's 5th Panzer Army had been broken. Of 262 tanks and assault guns committed to the offensive, only 62 remained operational. 86 were completely destroyed. 114 were damaged, broken down, or abandoned. The brand new Panzer brigades, equipped with the finest tanks Germany could produce, crewed by men who had received what wartime Germany could still afford in training, had been annihilated in their first major engagement. Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division lost 25 Shermans and 7 tank destroyers. Post-war analysis by the Army's Ballistic Research Laboratory, examining 30 armor-on-armor engagements involving the 3rd and 4th Armored Divisions, found that American formations achieved a 3.6 to 1 kill ratio against the Panther. Not because the Sherman was a better tank, it was not, by any honest technical assessment, but because the American formations were better fighting units, experienced crews, sound tactics, seamless combined arms integration, and a first-shot advantage built on terrain knowledge and positioning discipline that overcame every technical disadvantage their vehicles carried. Remember the 4 pillars we started with? Artillery faster than any response, air-ground integration that owned the daylight sky, institutional learning that rewrote doctrine in real time, and logistics at a scale that made everything sustainable. Those 4 pillars are what you are watching at Aricourt, operating without the sledgehammer of Cobra, just the scalpel of the system itself, and the system was enough. If your father or grandfather served in any branch of the military, in any theater of this war, I would be genuinely honored to read their story in the comments. What unit? What campaign? What did they see? Those specific details matter more than any official archive. They are the actual record. They deserve to be preserved by the people who carry them. Part 5. The verdict. What actually won. There is a 4th pillar we have not yet fully examined. The one that German commanders, reading their casualty reports in September 1944, were beginning to understand was the most fundamental problem of all. Not a tactical problem, not a doctrinal problem, a mathematical one. The United States produced 49,234 M4 Sherman tanks during the war. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panthers, 1,347 Tiger IIs, and 489 Tiger IIs. The ratio on medium and heavy tanks exceeded 6 to 1 in America's favor. At peak production, American factories were building over 2,000 Shermans per month. German Panther production peaked at 380 per month in July 1944 and never reached that figure again. Tiger I production never exceeded 104 in a single month. Every single month, America put more tanks in the field than Germany could build in 3 months. But raw numbers only begin to tell the story. The deeper American advantage was not just producing more tanks. It was keeping them running. The Sherman was engineered from the drawing board for mass maintenance in the field. Every major component was designed for rapid replacement by ordinary mechanics with standard tools. An entire engine swap could be accomplished in hours in a muddy forward area. The German Panther required a transmission change that could take days and demanded specialized equipment frequently unavailable in forward positions. The Panther also suffered from chronic mechanical failures. Roughly 5% broke down within the first 100 kilometers of road travel, 90% within 1,500 kilometers. German panzer divisions routinely operated below 50% armored strength, not because of combat losses, but because of mechanical attrition and the inability to recover damaged vehicles. The Wehrmacht was not fighting a war of attrition. It was losing one without the fighting. The American 5-echelon maintenance system kept operational rates high even after devastating combat losses. A Sherman knocked out on Monday might be back in action by Friday. The 3rd Armored Division entered Normandy with 232 Shermans, lost 648 tanks completely destroyed during the campaign, and had another 700 knocked out, repaired, and returned to service. That is a 580% replacement cycle. German commanders, watching American units absorb those losses and keep fighting, could not understand how it was operationally possible. They were fighting an army that could not be bled out. The Red Ball Express, 6,000 trucks running 24-hour shifts from the Normandy depots to the front, moving over 12,500 tons of supplies per day at its peak, was the largest military logistics operation ever conducted to that point. And when fuel shortages finally halted Patton's advance in September 1944, it was not because the system had failed. It was because Patton had moved so fast, so far, that even this massive infrastructure had run behind the spearhead. And in the middle of all of this, the production lines, the maintenance echelons, the Red Ball convoys, the artillery arriving in 3 minutes, the thunderbolts within radio call, there was a man whose story brings every pillar together in a single human life. Staff Sergeant Lafayette G. Poole, born in Odom, Texas, July 23, 1919. A farm kid who had studied engineering in college, boxed Golden Gloves in Texas and in England in early 1944, agreed to spar with heavyweight champion Joe Louis in an exhibition bout. He hit Louis twice before the champion got hold of him in a clinch and explained quietly that this was going to be a learning experience. Poole absorbed the lesson. He always absorbed lessons. Between June 27th and September 15th, 1944, Poole and his 4-man crew in 3 successive Shermans, all named In the Mood after the Glenn Miller song, destroyed 12 confirmed German tanks and 258 armored vehicles, self-propelled guns, and other vehicles. They killed over 1,000 German soldiers and took 250 prisoners. His task force led 21 major assaults. His crew, Red Richards, his driver, Schoolboy Close on the bow gun, Groundhog Aller as gunner, Jailbird Boggs as loader, had been together since training. In tank warfare, where survival is measured in milliseconds, crew cohesion of that kind is not a soft advantage. It is a tactical weapon. Poole's war ended on September 15, 1944, when a Panther ambushed his 3rd Sherman near the Siegfried Line at Münsterbusch. The first hit damaged the tank but didn't stop it. His driver reversed. The Panther fired again. The second round hit as the tank tipped at the edge of a ditch and flipped it. The explosion threw Poole from the commander's hatch. Shell fragments tore open his right leg. The leg was amputated 8 inches above the knee. He was 25 years old. He went home, was fitted for a prosthetic leg, opened a filling station in Corpus Christi, Texas, lived until 1991. The character War Daddy in the 2014 film Fury was reportedly inspired, at least in part, by his exploits, though the filmmakers changed enough that most viewers will never connect a fictional Brad Pitt character to the real Texas farm kid who actually did something far more extraordinary than any screenplay. By December 1944, Germany launched its final gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. 250,000 men, over 1,400 tanks. The last great armored offensive the Wehrmacht would ever mount. The goal was to split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. At a command conference on December 19th, Patton promised to disengage 3 divisions from active combat on the Saar front, turn them 90 degrees, and attack north within 48 hours. Eisenhower was skeptical. No army had ever executed a maneuver of that complexity at that speed in winter conditions. More than 133,000 vehicles reoriented on icy roads in blizzard conditions. 62,000 tons of supplies shifted. The 4th Armored Division covered 150 miles in 19 hours. Men drove without sleep. Tanks broke down and were pushed off the road. The column kept moving. On December 26th, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, in his 6th, Sherman named Thunderbolt, leading from the front as always, had just 20 operational tanks remaining. His men were exhausted. Bastogne needed them. He gave the order that entered American military history. We're going into those people now. Let her roll. First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding an M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman nicknamed Cobra King, led 9 tanks through the village of Assinois under a barrage of 2,340 artillery shells from 13 batteries, 8 minutes of fire that left the German defenders too stunned to react. At 4:50 in the afternoon of December 26th, Boggess reached the Bastogne perimeter. The first American he encountered was 2nd Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. "How are you?" Boggess asked. "Glad to see you," Webster replied. The 10-day siege was over. Cobra King is now restored and preserved at the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, a physical object that connects every pillar of the American system to a single moment of resolution. German commanders who survived the war eventually said, in their post-war memoirs and interrogations, what they had not said during it. Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored doctrine, the architect of the Panzer forces that conquered Europe, told American interrogators in 1945 that Patton had conducted a good campaign, and that from the standpoint of a tank specialist, he offered his congratulations, since Patton had acted exactly as Guderian himself would have acted. General Blumentritt, chief of staff of O.B. West, stated that the German High Command had regarded Patton as the most aggressive panzer commander the Allies possessed. The man who designed the doctrine that conquered Europe was complimenting the army he had dismissed as Britain's Italians in 1943. Historians have noted correctly that German post-war memoirs tend towards self-justification, emphasizing German tactical brilliance while attributing defeat to Hitler's interference and Allied material superiority. This is true, but the tactical observations appear genuine. American combined arms effectiveness, artillery response speed, logistical depth, and air-ground coordination surprised commanders who had conquered most of Europe with Panzer doctrine, not because the Americans had better individual weapons, because they had a better system. The United States Army of February 1943 was routed at Kasserine Pass. The United States Army of September 1944 annihilated 2 elite panzer brigades at Ericourt, at a kill ratio approaching 3-1, using tanks its own engineers acknowledged were individually inferior to their opponents. 18 months, same basic equipment, same training pipeline, radically different results. The difference was the institutional willingness to treat failure as information, to fire the people who failed and promote the people who learned, to rewrite doctrine in real time, to trust the sergeant with the welding torch and the pilot with the bazooka-armed Piper Cub and the 24-year-old tank ace from Odom, Texas, who kept his crew together through months of combat that should have killed them all. Organizations that build systems for learning outperform organizations that rely on individual excellence. Flexibility defeats rigidity. Coordination defeats isolation. The capacity to absorb failure and convert it into knowledge is, in the long run, more lethal than any weapon ever manufactured. Now go back to that Panther commander in the fog near Aracourt, September 19th, 1944. He had the better tank. His gun could kill at twice the range. His armor was superior. He had been fighting since 1941. By every reasonable metric, he was the more dangerous soldier. He was not fighting a better tank. He was fighting a system that had spent 18 months eating its own failures and converting them into something he had no doctrine to counter. Artillery that arrived before he heard the first shot, Hellcats that fired from positions he never located, air-ground coordination that owned every daylight hour, and somewhere above him in the gray September sky, a former history teacher in a fabric-covered airplane armed with bazookas who had decided that the rules of engagement were a suggestion. That is what terrified Germany's elite Panzer divisions. Not the Sherman, the system. And every man who built that system, from Kasserine to Aracourt to the gates of Bastogne, had a name. From Fredendall's replacement to Cullen's hedge-cutter to Pools and the Mood to Bogus and Cobra King, they deserved to be remembered by it. If this forensic breakdown gave you something to think about, hit that like button. It helps this analysis reach the viewers who care about accurate history, not comfortable history. Subscribe if you want the next chapter in this series, because the story of how America's military transformed in those 18 months is far from fully told. War is mathematics. But the men who fought it were not numbers. They had names, and they deserve to be remembered by them.